welcome to Read This Author's Corner. I am your host, Alice Maria James, and I am so excited to introduce you to our guest, author and educator, Kai Harris, the author of What the Fireflies Knew. Welcome, Kai. Welcome, Kai. It is so wonderful to meet you.
Thank you. It's so great to meet you too.
I have been enjoying your book, and before we jump into the book, I would love for you to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what it is that you want them to know. This is on you.
Okay. Well, yes. So I'm from Detroit originally. I grew up in Detroit, went to college in Michigan, and eventually moved out of Michigan, but I'm a Michigan girl through and through. So a lot of my books are set in Michigan, including What the Fireflies Knew, which is set in Lansing, Michigan. I am now an assistant professor of creative writing at Santa Clara University, where I teach some first-year writing classes and a lot of creative writing classes. So that's one of my big passions, is teaching other people about creative writing and building a writing practice. I'm also a mother. My husband and I have 3 daughters and a black lab puppy named Tabasco. So my home life is pretty busy as well. But yeah, we're pretty recently moved to the Bay Area of California. So we've been here for a couple of years, and I do love being outside, the weather and the nature, and going for hikes and going to the ocean. So that's what's been kind of going on with me for a while outside of all the writing.
Oh, how cool. I lived in San Francisco, not San Francisco proper, but in Concord from 2018 to 2020. Get into the book. I want to know what inspired this story.
Story was actually, so the book started off as a very short story that I wrote when I was in my master's program at Belmont University, which is in Nashville, Tennessee. And my professor had given us a writing prompt where we were supposed to try and remember something and put it down on the page as vividly as possible. And we were supposed to, we were practicing using sensory details and trying to write in a way that made people feel like they were there. And so I, at the time, remembered spending time in Lansing during summers as a child. So I grew up in Detroit. Lansing's, the main way that Lansing felt dissimilar to Detroit to me when I was growing up is that Detroit's a big city. It's very busy. It's very noisy. It's very, there are lots of people all of the time. In Lansing, where my grandfather lived, it was the opposite of that. It was a lot of nature, a lot of being outside, very quiet and slow. And it was one of the first times that I remember seeing certain things, like really seeing stars, right? Really seeing fireflies, which I called lightning bugs. But I used fireflies for the book because it sounded nice. But, in Lansing, you'd see like so many of them just all together in a field. And that was when I learned how to catch fireflies. So when I was writing that story, that's what I wrote about, because it was a memory that was really vivid to me and special to me. And what happened is, after I wrote that scene, I realized it was one of the best things that I had written, because it was the first time that I had really written anything from my own perspective. Prior to that, I had always felt like if I was sitting down to write a story, I had to put on some author cloak and like write about a particular thing or about particular people or in a particular way. So I was never writing from my own perspective. And so that was the first time that I did. And I loved how it felt. And other people enjoyed the piece as well. And so then I thought to myself, what if I actually tried to make a book out of this? And so the first thing I did was, made it fiction, because at that point it was very much based on my own experience. But one, I don't want to write a memoir, at least not right now. And two, my experience I knew wasn't going to be interesting enough for a book. So instead, I thought about what kind of character could I put into this setting that I know very well, that I love, that I can describe very vividly, what kind of character could I put into that setting and what could be happening to her that would make for a very interesting story. So that's how it came to be.
Like about your writing is that there is enough bad and good. You know, I quite often I find that people layer on so much tragedy and so much trauma where books are supposed to be somewhat of an escapism. Um, but when the characters in the book are so downtrodden and have one bad experience after another bad experience, it becomes like you're taking on someone else's weight. I felt that it had an innocence about it, even through the tragedies and whatever else was going on. It seems a realistic portrayal of challenges. It didn't feel like it was overdone, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that because that was exactly what I was trying to do. I feel the same way as you know, wanting to strike that balance. I didn't want the book to be too heavy or just all about trauma. I think something I wanted to showcase is, first of all, how, you know, I wanted to be authentic to the Black experience. And I think that there can be a lot of trauma in the Black experience. So I didn't want to shy away from that completely. But I also wanted to show that even in the midst of that, we still regular people, right? And kids are still regular kids and have regular kid stuff going on. So although this book begins with the trauma, and you know, you learn this even before the book has began, the father has passed away and the family's grieving that loss. But KB is also an ordinary 10 or 11-year-old girl who's worried about trying to play with her big sister and trying to make friends and, just figuring out who she is. And all of those things are true regardless of what else is going on. So that was something I definitely wanted to highlight. And, you know, I think there are a lot of quiet moments in this book that are also, so it's not even just the balance of trauma and joy, because I wanted to have both of those. But I also wanted to just have some regular moments, you know, that are just kind of in between, you know, the scenes where KB is learning to cook with her grandfather, or, quietly reading a book in her tree. Just moments that show that, like, there are so many parts of this experience. It's not all trauma. It's not all joy. But it's a full experience.
Which I am extremely sorry, which I'm extremely happy for, because quite often I find that the story that is told of us, even when we're telling it, is, I always say, it is the single mom and the struggle is real. You know, it's that only one dynamic. And one of the things that I love in this story too is the role of the grandfather, because you know, quite often we don't give fathers, and forget about grandfathers, we don't even give most of the time fathers don't even get a starring positive role in a book. There's this very one-sided narrative, I feel, where it almost seems like every Black girl doesn't know her father. For me, who I will tell everyone that I'm a daddy's girl, not just to the bone, but to the marrow. Um, and I have a lot of friends that have grown up with their father, but those stories don't get told. So it was very refreshing to see the grandfather's role, to really feel that the grandfather not only cared deeply about his grandchildren, but also cared deeply about his daughter, you know, her well-being. Yes. So what made that important to you, for you to highlight that?
Back when I was writing that story, it started with my grandfather, who I spent time with during the summers when I was growing up. And I had a very different relationship with my grandfather than KB, mostly because I knew my grandfather really well. I spent lots of time with him. We would go almost every summer and spend time. Something that I found out after I got older, which kind of plays right into what you're talking about, is, that my mother and my grandfather had a complicated relationship. And I didn't know about that as a child, but my mom has told me since I've gotten older what it meant to her to see her father building such a solid relationship with her daughters after the two of them didn't have quite a solid relationship. And that was a dynamic I really wanted to explore. So that was something I played around with the characters in this story. I also I feel like when I was growing up, there was such a large presence of grandparents, of extended family. We grew up often living with other parts of our family, living with my grandmother, living with uncles. There were just different times in our lives for whatever reason where we'd all just be living together. And that was such a big part of our experience. And again, a thing that I don't see a lot of. And so I wanted to also just show the importance of that extended family. I think that Black folks in particular have a need for that level of community, for that type of generational kinship or tightness or what have you. So I wanted to highlight that dynamic. It's interesting because my own relationship with my father was a tad bit complicated. But I also would, consider myself a daddy's girl in a lot of ways. Although we had a bit of a complicated relationship, and I wanted to capture that kind of dynamic with KB and Nia and their father. Although he's already passed away before the story begins, the father character is felt throughout the story in KB's memories of him. And I wanted to show that although he was struggling with addiction and not able to be there for his family in different ways because of that, he was still a really good father. He showed his daughters a lot of love. I wanted to show the preciousness of that relationship from KB's perspective, and show also how, even as that was tainted a bit, as she she's getting older, she's going to learn new things and different things about her father and what types of things he did and what he was struggling with. But for her, it was very important that she not let go of the preciousness of what they shared. And that was something that I really wanted to highlight because of my own kind of complicated relationship. My father was around for most of my life, but passed away when I was 23. And so while I didn't have and he had cancer. So, I had a very different experience than KB, but writing about the loss of a father felt like something that I needed to do for myself as well. And to think about the dynamics, the nuances, how it felt different for me to lose him than it did for my sister, for example, was another thing explored in the novel. It happened differently for them, but that's something that also was near to me. So everything was kind of building off of things that I wanted to explore, that I was interested in thinking about for one reason or another, but just trying to put them into new terms through KB and her family.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I recently shared with someone, I don't think it was on an interview, but the fact that the lack of fathers being represented in a lot of the stories. And a couple of years ago, I tried to interview a few girl dads that I knew that had real close relationships with their daughters, and nobody wanted to be interviewed. Nobody, because they didn't feel perfect. They privately told me all of their shortcomings and all the reasons why they couldn't be an example of what a good father would be. Is this bias that as a mother, you don't necessarily have to be perfect to be praised as a good mother, but as a father, you have to be perfect or you're not allowed to speak on it or talk about it. You can't have any kind of complexities. You couldn't have made a mistake and then talk about the fact that you are a father, or now you're a better father. Maybe you had a child before and you weren't a good father, but over time you've now grown and matured. But because you messed up the first time, you don't get a chance to acknowledge your growth. So I love the fact that you put the father in there. You showed their love for their father, even in his flawedness. And for me, that was refreshing. That was different. That makes your book stand out to me in a way that I don't see happen that often. And again, there is an innocence about the book, but there is still a lot of truth. It's not overly flowery. It's not like, oh, life is all butterflies and roses. It's not that, but on the same token, it's not life is we have so many of those books where, especially when it comes to girl children, they are abused and you name it. So to get away from that and to see something different, I just feel like there's just been one voice or one direction for so long. I'm very happy to see that somebody's willing to step in a different direction. So, what else is there? What couldn't you tell me that you really wanted people to get from meeting KB?
I mentioned before that I hadn't written from my own perspective before writing that story. And I think that one thing I really wanted people to get from KB's story was just how universal it is. I think Black writers, we're often told or made to believe that Black stories are not going to sell as well, or they're not going to be marketable, or they're going to be too niche, or what have you, which is interesting because I grew up not reading any Black stories, and I somehow always found myself in every, all the stories that I read. I was able to relate. I was able to understand myself better, understand other people better, because I have empathy, and it taught me empathy. Reading books taught me empathy and strengthened that skill. But I didn't get a lot of reading books about people like me, which is another part that's super important, to show me that my identity is valid, to show me that my perspective is one that other people share, that sort of thing. So I wrote about this in my acknowledgments, but for a long time, I would look at my family, look at my life and how it went. And I would just be like, what is wrong with us? Why can't we just be regular? And to me, regular was, the mostly white families that I was seeing on TV or reading about in books, or, and it for a long time made me struggle with my own identity, this sense of like, I feel so different from all the characters that I read about. I don't see myself in anything that I read. So, I wanted to write this story so that other people could see themselves. And, it's funny because this book was actually written for adults. Now it's crossing over into young adults. So I have readers from all different age groups. But, it was just as much for, women, Black women who are not Black girls anymore, but can read this book and remember things. And I think some of the very meaningful interactions that I've had with readers are Black women who have come to me and said, girl, you described my childhood, or you described this part of my childhood so well, or I had that same experience. That's really moving to me. The other thing that's really moving to me is how many people come to me who don't share any aspect of my identity, right? People who are much older, people who are much younger, people who are different races, people who are, have different abilities or disabilities, people who represent all types of perspectives of identity, who come to me and say, KB was so much like me. I saw so much of myself in KB. I saw so much of my family dynamic in this family or with this sibling dynamic. So it doesn't matter, right? I like to say that I write Black stories. That's what I feel like I write. But that doesn't mean that only Black people will be able to read them or find themselves in those stories. Everybody will be able to. But I write Black stories. That's something I pride myself on because I'm coming from my perspective for once. I'm saying, here is this experience. I want to put it down. And I hope that other people will read it and gain that skill, that empathy, to be able to see and understand a new perspective, and also to see, wow, we have so much in common, right? Turns out all of these stories are universal. It's not just white stories that are universal. All of our stories are universal because we have humanity in common. And that's something that I really wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I totally agree because, as you said, when you grow up and you read mainly white stories, you learn empathy. You see, and some things you can see yourself, some things it's like, okay, I've never experienced that, but it's good to know that that's out there. Um, and if we can adapt to other people's story, if other people want to, they can adapt to our stories, because a lot of the things are universal. Disagreeing with your sister, trying to win that approval of older sibling, as you said, coming of age, these things are universal experiences that don't have a color. But what's nice is seeing how they unfold differently based on who you are, how you were raised, your culture, your ethnicity. What I feel is missing, like, I'm not a huge TV person because I feel like what is on there is just the same things recycled over and over and over and over. An experience from one perspective. Like, I love when I see things that you show how another culture approaches it, you know? Oh, wow, I never even thought about that, you know? Oh, the nuances of the fact that we both have gone through the same experiences, but our upbringing and our culture will have us approach it or do something a little bit different. That's what I love. And that's what I see in this book that draws me to the content of the book. It's a universal experience through the eyes of the culture, the experience of this person. So that, I was happy. I was extremely happy to see that. I just feel like everything is the Godfather with different skin color, you know?
Right.
I'm like, isn't this like the Godfather? But is he just changing it, changing up the Godfather? Um, so the wholeness that is our culture of everybody not growing up in the drug world, and this more richness in we all are, and to actually have authors that are willing to tell different stories. I am so happy for you.
I love picking up a book and learning about a different culture, and it's from a perspective that I'm not as familiar with. A book I love that I teach often is How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. And I think one of the things I love about that novel is, first of all, it's told from the perspective of a variety of sisters, so you're getting different perspectives within the same novel. But their experience is very different than mine. They immigrate to the United States. They have a completely different family situation, a different identity. Because of their identity, they have things that happen to them that have not happened to me, right? For example, being English language learners and what that looks like when you're in elementary school and the ways that people might interact with that or engage with that. So there are so many things in that novel that were not my experience. But that was a novel that I read, and I felt like I saw so much of myself reflected in those stories. And I teach that book to my students oftentimes, and I get that same reaction from all of my students, regardless of where they've come from, what their experience is. Sure, I have some students who have very similar experiences, and I can tell that reading that book feels even more meaningful to them in some ways. But all of us get something from it. And that's exactly the point is, you know, I hope that my Black readers will read my books and feel very welcome and feel like, you know, oh yeah, I know this story. I know this reference. I know what she's talking about, right? But I want everyone to be able to read my stories and learn something new about this perspective. You know, I don't want to, just like you said, I don't want to write the exact same kind of stories. I want to think about aspects of the Black experience that maybe we're not tapping into as much. My next book, which I don't think I'm allowed to talk about yet, but one of the big themes of that book is internalized anti-Blackness in young Black people, which is a thing that I don't feel like I read a lot about, don't hear a lot about. But it's more than just us as Black people looking outwards and seeing anti-Blackness, because of course we do. But it's also about looking inwards and seeing which of these things live inside of me. How are these things making me feel about myself as a young person trying to figure out my identity in a world where people hate Blackness? How does that make me feel about my Blackness, right? And so those are the kinds of themes that like I haven't read about a ton, but I've lived a ton about, you know. And so when I sit down to write, I want to think about trying to put down some of those experiences so that other people can start to see and understand, like, yeah, wow, I hadn't thought about that.
The way you write, I like the fact that you are willing to tell different stories, which I'm so for. I'm just so exhausted of the same. We have one. It's only our culture, who we are as a people, all fall into this one category or yeah. So, and when you know that's not true, and the vast majority of us have so many different experiences, and to only see one experience written, it really feels hurtful, and it gives the world a one-sided view of who we are, whereby you can see other nationalities and you can get a very holistic view of who they are. And I don't believe that we're afforded that in some ways. And then in other ways, I feel like because what we're trying to do is cater to the masses for, you know, if I'm selling a book and I'm trying to be a bestseller, well, let me use this, what has worked for everybody else. Let me not take a chance on telling a different story, because these stories sell. I don't know if this story is going to sell. So then everything starts to sound and be the same, because we want to get the numbers and not necessarily the representation. Taking that chance on putting out the representation and seeing it give the numbers to match, it makes me excited that you can have a book that has veered away from the norm and get that recognition. That way I feel like, okay, the door is now open for other people to walk down this path. We can now tell different stories and know that our different stories are appreciated. So I thank you for your boldness, and I thank you for taking that chance, because without people like you that are willing to do it and stand in their authenticity and stand in their truth, we get the same stories over and over and over again.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
So, is there something that you would like to share with the audience before we wrap up? Is there a takeaway or something that you would want them to hold in their hearts about this book and about you?
Just thinking about what you just said, and I had to pause there to just really hear that, because is very meaningful to me. And I think it's often very difficult for me to see myself in those ways, like to see that I'm doing something that's important. So I wanted to sit in that for a moment. And I think that that's a big part of what I want to do. And, when people ask me about writing and they tell me they want to write, one of the things I'm always saying is, stay true to what makes you want to write, no matter what happens, because it's a tough industry. And you're right. I'm very new in the publishing industry, and I've already faced challenges in regards to telling the stories that I want to tell, having to, feel pressure to follow certain trends, to move in certain directions, right? But always remaining driven by my own sense of what I'm doing this for. For me, that's what's most important. I think that I want to be successful in as much as I want to say something to the world. I want my voice to be heard. I feel like I have things to say. I've always been an extremely empathetic person and a storyteller, and a person that, I feel like I get across my points. And, I've always been told that since I was a little kid. And, I think, okay, this is my gift. What am I going to do with it? And, writing books makes so much sense for me. It's my way of trying to share what I feel like I know, what I'm learning, what I hope to learn. And so, I think that as long as I have this writing career, that's what I intend to try to keep doing, is to stay true to that. And, I think when my second book comes out, then it'll make sense, and y'all will understand, that I really mean that, and if there's a story and I feel like it needs to be told, then I'm going to try and do everything I can to tell it, whatever that costs. So, I think that that's something that's really important to me. And, being able to have this moment, having Fireflies debut, seeing the success of this book, I had no idea. I would have never imagined that this would have happened. I could dream it. But honestly, some of the things that happened for this book, I didn't even dream of. That's how amazing it's been. And I'm just so thankful for the reception, so thankful that people care to read such a quiet story of Black girlhood, a story that's just, there's nothing else there. There are no frills and no thrills. I'm not luring you in with any dramatic, over the top plot point. And people still really care to read this book. And people write me letters, people write me emails, people write me posts on, DMs, people post on social media about how much this book means to them. And that is everything that I could have hoped for and imagined at the start of this. So, I think I just wanted to say that this journey has been incredible. And, I hope that I'm going to just continue to stay on it and put out stories that matter to people.
Well, I hope you stay on it, and I hope you can continue to put out these authentic stories. And that is true. You used the perfect word. I couldn't, because I didn't want to say simple, because that wasn't not the word, but it is a quiet story. It is a quiet story. It's impactful, and it is a quiet story. And I am so thankful that you're pushing back against being put in a mold or a one direction, because now that it is seen that a Black person can write a quiet story that gets recognition, it makes me happy. It really makes me happy, just because there are excellent quiet stories out there that don't get written, that don't get spoken about, because the box says they won't sell, to be someone that has broken that shell of what was said, probably was told that wouldn't work, and for it to be working, I am happy.
Thank you so much.
I am happy for you. I am so happy. And hopefully, when you complete your next project, I can have you back on and we can talk about that, because I genuinely believe you're an inspiration for a new way of seeing us as a people, seeing us in our wholeness, seeing us in our fullness, seeing us in our depth and our breadth of who we are, not just a superficial hip hop version of us. So I thank you. I thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to say a special thank you to Kai Harris for joining us. Please go out and pick up a copy of her book, What the Fireflies Knew. This has been Read This. I am your host, Alice Maria James. Until next time, keep reading.